Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're talking about texture fill rate or texture filter rate. This is part of my efforts to define all of the GPU terminology that you run into when looking at new video cards. And this is something I already wrote about. You can hit the link in the annotations or description below if you're interested in learning more about texture fill rate. For video purposes, we're going to look at the TMUs very briefly, the texture filter rate in more depth, and then the core clock and how all three of these elements relate. So when you're looking at, say, a GTX 980, and I'm using this only because I know the specs off the top of my head, a GTX 980 has a TMU count of 128, a core clock of 1126 megahertz, and a texture filter rate or fill rate of 144.1 gigatexels per second. So these are the numbers we're interested in. So the filter rate represents how many texels per second the GPU is capable of applying colors to, of applying bitmaps to, of applying filtration processes to, like bilinear, trilinear, and anisotropic filtering, and it's measured in gigatexels per second. So you've seen these settings in games before, whether or not you understand them. There's bilinear filtering, trilinear, and anisotropic. And those filtering technologies effectively look at how an object is being drawn on your screen relative to the camera. So you might not have an oblique view of an object. An object might be like the floor in front of me, or imagine a road in a racing game. It's not an oblique angle to the camera, it's an odd angle, and it scales off into the distance like a vanishing point. So what anisotropic filtering will do is help take something like the dots on the road, the lines, the dotted lines, and it will make sure that they vanish into the distance in a smoother and more realistic sense. Without any filtering process at all, in the old days, what would happen is the texture would stretch because it's being applied to a square space rather than something like a trapezoidal space, which makes more sense when you've got a road going like that into the distance. So the texture fill rate is what is being saturated when you're applying these technologies like anisotropic filtering. It's also being saturated just when you're coloring a texel, because on the screen you've got several different objects, you've got tons of different textures being drawn to each object, and the video card needs to determine what color each individual dot on the screen should be at any given time based on your movements, based on the camera angle, based on lighting and shadows and all of this stuff. And that's where we need a big pipe. So at 144.1 gigatexels per second, that's 144 billion texels per second that the GPU can process. This sounds like a huge number, and it is, but it's maybe not quite so huge as you would think, because you need to take into account that we're processing texels every second, 60 times per second, for an average of 60 FPS, which is sort of what we need as a playable frame rate. So if you've got a 4K screen, just pretend for a second, you've got a 4K screen, that means you have 8.3 million pixels on your screen, and that's a lot of pixels. So the GPU needs to draw these 60 times per second if you want a 60 FPS, and it needs to apply filters to them, and it's drawing off-screen pixels for other technologies. So suddenly you're at 8.3 million times 60, which is approaching 500 million texels or so per second. That's a lot. It's not 144 billion, which is what our number is, but it's still a lot. And then you've got to apply a technology like anisotropic filtering 4x, for example. So now you're filtering it 4 times, and you're up to 2 billion texels per second. And then we can draw off-screen objects. This is new-ish in gaming, in that, let's say, pretend off my camera there's a tower, and below me there's a pool. The pool is reflecting that tower, and I can see the pool on my screen, and I can see the reflection of the tower on the screen. The GPU is taking these texels, it's taking these textures, it's taking all this data of the tower, and it's applying it to the pool in front of me. So it's drawing an off-screen object on screen in a reflection. That consumes yet more of our pipe, and that's why we need such a large pipe. Still, you're basically never going to approach anywhere close to 144 billion texels per second, even with the highest end games, because you're going to hit other bottlenecks before you get there, and games just don't push that kind of throughput. Not yet, anyway. And these are things we said 10 years ago when 1 gigatexel seemed impossibly high, but we surpassed that. Still, though, even in the worst case load scenario, you're pushing 1 to 4 billion texels. it's not even, not even close to 144. But that is what texture fill rate is, and it is calculated by taking the count of texture mapping units multiplied by the core clock of the GPU, and then that gives you texture fill rate. So in the case of a GTX 980, you've got 128 units times 1126 megahertz, and that is a measurement over time. And then that gives you 144 gigatexels per second, because you can see the math on the screen. That's how it does it. So that's where TMUs are relevant. And each texture mapping unit is capable of processing one texel per cycle, basically. So you've got 1126 megahertz. Those are cycles of the GPU. And each TMU can process one texel. So that's why it's 128 times the core clock. In the old days, this wasn't always true. In the Voodoo 2 technology, there were 2 texture mapping units, which was a big deal, and they weren't always as good as just strictly 2 texture mapping units because they had a rule. Each unit had to work on the same texel or pixel at any given time. So even though you've got 2 units, they need to work on the same texel, and if the texel only has one texture applied to it, that means only one unit has a job to do. The other one, it's like hiring too many people to do the same job. Now, in these days, dual texturing was becoming a thing, so there were often multiple textures applied to a single point in space where things are overlapping. So that meant each unit could function on the same texel because each unit is processing a different texture. But it just goes to show that the marketed rate, or 144.1 gigatexels in this modern instance, is not always representative of a real-world use case. And this is also true with AMD, where you've got a different amount of floating point TMUs from integer TMUs. So in a game that uses floating point, you've actually got fewer TMUs available to you than in something, some encoding or rendering task that uses integer units, which will way outperform the FP unit. So as far as texture fill rate and whether it's relevant, the answer is yes, with hesitation, because all the texels on your screen, which is every single 3D dot in space that has a texture applied to it, needs to be filtered, because the GPU needs to determine what color it should be, needs to determine what sort of filtering is being applied in terms of bilinear and isotropic, whatever, how many times that texel is being sampled. That's what the 4x means. It means each texel is being sampled 4 times if you have 4x. That's a lot. That's producing a lot of load on the GPU suddenly. And it samples it 4 times because it's trying to be more accurate in smoothing and determining colors and things like that. And all these other factors. So it's important, but you're never going to approach the numbers before you start hitting other bottlenecks like memory available or CPU bottlenecks or whatever. Really all kinds of other bottlenecks first. That doesn't mean it's unimportant. It just means that as gamers, we don't utilize that pipe so heavily. So that is texture fill rate and how TMUs and core clock and everything relate. Again, link in the description below for the full article. It might be a bit easier to follow than this video because there are a lot of numbers and sometimes it's hard to follow in a video. Please like this video and subscribe to the page. It helps a lot. Check out our new Patreon page. It's linked in the description below. If you want to support these videos and upgrade the lighting or help get us to conventions or improve camera equipment, check the Patreon page. It will help a lot, even for small support amounts. So that's this content. I will be in CES next week. See you all next time. Peace.